Hey, I'm gonna tell what the guy just told you about the right to bear arms thing. So
Yeah.
because you're the pro, I guess it makes more sense for you to say why it is a big deal, and then I'll just dispute that, I guess.
Okay.
Okay.
Got any
Got any
feedback on my
feedback on
end?
my end? No, I mean everything sounds good.
Okay. So climate change is a big deal because it affects almost every aspect of what it means for us to be humans. It affects the weather where we live. It affects what we eat. It affects um, how we commute. It affects our interactions between one another. It impacts everything that we do. Maybe in small ways. Maybe sometimes climate change doesn't matter in a particular area. But when you're talking about climate change, it's not that big of a deal relatively. I struggle to understand what you mean by relatively. If you're wanting to say that climate change isn't a big deal to an individual in a particular situation, say an individual that has a gun to his head, yes, in that particular situation, climate change isn't a big deal relative to the danger that that individual is in. But if you're talking about humanity as a whole, if we want to talk about the continuation of our race at the same level of comfort that we're living at now, nothing impacts the entire human race as much as climate change does. Climate change impacts differently all over, but it's not. It has changed our environment. It's changed. Um, like I said, it impacts basically every aspect that humans all over the world does. Now, is it going to matter too much to me in my individual life? No. So I just need to understand when you're saying climate change isn't that big deal relatively. Are you coming at it from an individual's point of view, or you're saying that there's something from the aspect that I'm taking it? If there is there something that affects humanity more than climate change? I mean, I'm not familiar with what that could be.
So yeah, that is my argument. When I say relatively, I mean in comparison to more important issues from my perspective, of course, like poverty or economics in general, technology, war. These all seem to have more measurable, immediate consequences that appear to me to be far worse than anything predicted by.
All right. When you're talking about, say, poverty, we can go into, say, the lack of food. Would you say that climate change impacts the way that we're able to grow crops throughout the world and sustainable crops?
Absolutely,
When,
it's absolutely the case that climate affects crops,
so,
but
so if climate affects crops and the ability to make food and get that food to the right places, because you can't get it anywhere if it's not growing very well, or it's not growing in the correct season, or it's not ripening at the right time because climate has changed, then that's going to be an impact that's going to be negative. So if you're talking about war, if weather has changed and now people are fighting over resources that are more scarce, so climate change is going to impact the availability of water. It's going to impact the availability of land that's suitable for growing food. So that's going to be things that are going to cause more war and more conflict. So as that changes, climate change is going to impact that. So yes, for individuals involved in an immediate war, even if a large number of individuals, say two large countries, are at war, yes, it is climate change doesn't matter in their here and now, but as a whole, the impact of climate change is it's because the impact of climate change isn't something that can change in a month or in a year, that it's something that is going to take decades to change, and we're going to be fighting with the already the impacts that from what we've been doing the last 200 years. It's something that's going to impact humanity as a whole, there more so than any individual event. So you're talking about poverty. Poverty is a big problem. It's something that we need to deal with, but it's not a big problem in every single part of the world. And if you're talking about humanity as a whole, climate change is going to have more of an impact than poverty does.
so I dispute that. But I just want to say real quickly, that's why I use the word relatively, because that's how I see the universe in general, right? It's
Mm-hmm.
not just the climate change issue. It's in order to even recognize a concept or object, you have to have a background to compare it to, right? So everything is relative to everything else. Everything must be compared to other things. I mean, that is the basis of all knowledge. So when you say that climate change will impact people more than poverty, it seems like we're talking about demonstrable, measurable effects. Is that your claim, or?
Well, let's see. Do you agree that if climate change, I mean, I assume you agree climate change is true, but if you,
I believe humans have contributed to climate change, and these have been measurable impacts that are agreed upon within the scientific community. If the science says something, I don't dispute that.
so if we agree that if we continue to raise the temperature of our planet, say another couple degrees, that it's going to become inhospitable to human life.
No, not even close.
I'm just saying, but that's what they're saying, is that we're going to go too far.
The media is saying that, but that's not what the science says at all.
Okay. So
I mean, just to give you an example, we've already survived greater fluctuations with like no technology or science. So preposterous.
Well, we're not arguing now that the human race won't survive, that the hardiest of us won't survive to continue to be on. I mean, I don't think that climate change is at risk of causing us to go extinct. But if we're talking about maintaining our level of sophistication, maintaining our level of comfort as it is even now.
Right. So that is a product of us having CO2 emissions. You acknowledge that part, right? Like the life we enjoy here and now is a product of us changing the climate, right? You know that.
I do. I do know that. But not the I would say not our modern life. I would say the product of how we did things in the past over the last through our industrial stage, not to the modern age. I would not go so far as to say that the modern age, if we had started with the modern age now, we wouldn't be in the same predicament. It's the building up that we've done that caused the damage that we are now suffering for and will continue to suffer for the foreseeable future.
So the Industrial Revolution is widely regarded among most historians as the single most significant thing that humans have done. Probably the agricultural revolution is.
I would say that would probably be more significant than industrial.
It's questionable because if you measure it by the way that it has actually impacted the lives of every single person on this planet, and because we have so many more lives now than we did then, sure, it's disputable. But it's up there. It's if it's not more than the ag revolution, it's at least equal there.
I would concede that it's. I mean, I'm not arguing that what has happened is bad, if that's what you mean. I'm just saying that.
I mean, I would say it's good. Like the idea that you and I are talking to each other right now, and you're in a house and I'm in a house, and we're not worried about where we're gonna get our next meal and things like that.
Yeah, you're still in Hawaii, so we're an ocean apart.
Right. Yeah, it's pretty amazing.
So we're not in disagreement that what has happened so far isn't a good thing. But what I think is when we talk about the big deal, like the next big problem. So when I want to say, when you're talking about the next thing that we need to fix, that's what I would say would be what's the biggest problem. If you're going to say,
I would actually dispute the claim that climate change is the biggest problem facing society, humans, our government, whatever. Like, I would actually dispute that there are many things that I can name off the top of my head that are potentially more impactful than climate change.
Okay, and when you say we know that climate change is impactful. So which ones do you say are potentially more impactful than climate change?
Well, war, for example, I think can produce much more measurable effects. I think the negative consequences of war, on average, can be demonstrated to be worse than the predicted consequences of climate change.
What I think you're saying is that if we were to have, say, another world war, that a potential war could be a bigger deal than climate change, because that could have a more immediate impact
Not even that. Like I would even say, like even the minor wars, right? The non-hot wars or whatever, like Iraq or Vietnam.
I would have to push back and say I don't think that the modern conflicts that we are experiencing is more damaging to humanity as a whole than climate change. I would think because they are isolated geographically, they are isolated culturally. I mean, you're military, right? So
I was.
you was military. So you're taking it from a different stance than I. I have come from a military family, but not military myself. But here in the United States, we're not as impacted as other isolated areas in the country that are actually having the war. So there are tons of places. There are more countries that are not at war, with significant more people that are still being affected by climate change, because we agree that climate change is a global phenomenon. War in itself
I think that counts against you, because in America, you're not really being affected by climate change. So like the same argument still applies. We are still talking about poor others somewhere else, right? For the most part.
I mean, that's a good point. If you're going to say that we're able, through our technology or through our society, to counteract the effects of climate change in our local populations, that's good for me, but that doesn't mean that it's still not a problem. It's 60 degrees here in Tennessee in the middle of December. I mean, maybe people want to argue that doesn't have anything to do with climate change, but I mean, it seems to be something. We have more hurricanes, we have more. You'll of course stop me if you don't think that these are related to climate changes, the changes in the average temperatures, the changes in the destructive natures of the hurricanes, or the frequency that we see in this area.
That's a lot more disputed than you've probably been led to believe. You may think that there's a consensus that this or that hurricane is the product of climate change, but I can assure you that is not based upon a sound reading of the science.
I definitely don't think that there's a universal consensus. I would say that there's a majority consensus, but I'm not going to say that it's not like evolution or.
What the consensus actually says is, based upon the models and based upon what we know about physics and chemistry, geology, everything combined, science in general. Based upon that, we believe that it may be the case that climate change could impact weather, and it may produce more hurricanes, but to narrow it down to any particular hurricane and say, this is worse because of climate change, or this hurricane wouldn't exist without climate change, that's not how it works at all.
Right, but you would concede that if a scientist or a group of scientists were to say, give me some predictions of what the effects of climate change were, they might come out with an idea that says, change in average temperature, more frequent, more powerful hurricanes. That might be something that they predict. Now, when we see it, I mean, that's definitely going to be what is predicted by.
There's a caveat, because science is inherently conservative. Science is always cautious. If you actually read the reports, they always give like a confidence level in each prediction. And as far as hurricanes go, or more stormy weather or flooding, the confidence is not as great as you might suspect.
Okay, and I'm willing to grant you that, but I can't grant that it doesn't have an impact. It seems like it's universally accepted that it does have an impact,
an unquantifiable impact, sure,
but not a positive one. Would you say that the impact?
Well, in general, I don't think hurricanes are positive. I mean, they could be interpreted that way, but
which is it wasn't on. Was it Puerto Rico? The Puerto Rican president surely, not president, governor surely thinks it had something to do with climate change. I mean,
it was the king, I guess, according to Trump, or
but he or she definitely thought that it had something to do with climate change. Now, she could be completely wrong and off base, but it would seem like, given her experiences, that I think that is a good example, is you have these small areas that are being impacted by our changing climate that's brought about. They're not, the point that she was making, which I think is good, that small area is not impacting the climate as much as, say, the United States or, say, China or India or any of these other countries that just have so much bigger impact on our climate change.
That's the thing. That's precisely the thing. Like, just because someone who lives in Puerto Rico believes that, you know, the hurricane was due to climate change or an act of God or whatever, does not necessarily mean that's true. You know that, right?
I do know that it doesn't necessarily mean it's true, but I'm just saying it seems careless to just say that they're completely wrong when we can intellectually accept that stronger hurricanes would be a product of climate change, right?
They might be.
Might.
Well, here's the dispute. So, like, meteorologists tend to be on one side of this issue in the same way that climate scientists are on one side, you know, and it's hard to make the case that climate is more predictable than the weather. I mean, it's extremely difficult to make that case. And I don't know, like a lot of meteorologists, a lot of them are saying, wait a minute, you know, we're not absolutely confident in our predictions of what the weather is going to be like next week, and you guys are projecting out for like centuries.
Now, as I understand it, I mean, climate change is a science that I don't know what the term is, but spans, you know, eons, right? So they have millions of years worth of data of different, I don't know if it's millions of years, hundreds of thousands of years, millions of years of different data of what the climate is like. And so they can tell when a climate gets to a certain way, what the environment is going to be like. So we have changed our environment so that it's moving towards another, say, a certain kind of environment.
But I mean, think about kind of the logic that you're using. You're seeing going to have a huge impact if, you know, if we raise the temperature by a few degrees, and, you know, the sea levels will rise. But you have to remember, like, within human history, we've already risen, like the sea levels have already risen by like 100 meters. And we're talking about whether it may or may not rise 1 or 2 meters in the modern age with all of our science and technology. So it seems highly unlikely that this will actually be a threat to the human species in any, you know, significant.
Well, I would push back there. As the water has risen over the course of human history, we've been able to move and adapt and move our entire villages. Now, do we have cities now that are on sea level where say a 3 meter rise or a 1 meter rise would put their entire city underwater? Not their entire city, but their entire foundations of their water. Well, you can't move a city the same way that you can move a village. And especially when you're trying to, say, you take the, I don't know if the United States is the best, we have a lot of open land, but say you take to a more crowded city that's coastal, and you're going to try to move a city to somewhere that's already occupied by more people. So when you try to take 1 million people that live on a city that's,
by the way, happens every day, but go on.
Where you try to move 1 million people to already occupied.
Like, cities just grow, you know, according to like many random variables and all kinds of things. Like, people just move around and flock to different places for a variety of reasons. So, I mean, that's already happening.
But those people, other people then can move into the city because the city is still there. But if climate change brings about 1 meter or 3 meter water rise, then we're going to lose that significant area to house people because it'll be underwater. Human beings can't yet live underwater. So if we have seaside cities that are then flooded, or at least their foundations are flooded, we'll have to redesign the buildings. I mean, it's not something that we can't overcome, but it's definitely going to be a problem, especially if it takes place in the United States. It won't be as big of a problem because we have the money, we have the technology, we have the resources to change the looks of our cities, to relocate people. But in an island village or somewhere where if you have an entire city on an island, that a 3 meter rise in water makes the island disappear. So these people have now lost their entire, and they have to go somewhere.
So now 3 meters of sea level rise. We know that's not the consensus, right? Or do we
Well,
need to get?
I don't know. I just what is the consensus? How much?
So if we're going by the ICCP, which is widely regarded as the consensus, would you dispute that part?
No, that's fine.
Okay, so
I'm not going to dispute
government panel on climate change.
Yeah.
They came together and they came to this, created a consensus document, more or less, right?
Right. Okay.
So the worst case scenario, as predicted, and this is the worst case. This is assuming we do nothing at all.
Okay.
This is assuming that coal remains the dominant fuel source for the next century. So technology does not improve in any way in the next century, which of course is preposterous, but let's just go with it for whatever reason. So technology doesn't improve in the next century. We burn all the coal and oil that is even known to exist. So every proven reserve, we just fucking burn it all up, and we just emit all these CO2 gases. And meanwhile, over in Africa, population doubles, and they don't follow the same trends as everywhere else for some reason. Like as wealth increases, population tends to, not continue to increase as it does. But for some reason, according to RCP 8.5, they just increase the population, but they don't, slow down for whatever reason. There's no real explanation for why that would be the case. But
I guess the high levels of poverty would be the only counteractive to that.
But no. See, that's the thing, because we're burning all this fuel, which means that they're being lifted out of poverty. But in any case, they don't follow the same trends as everyone else. So in that nightmare scenario where we do nothing at all, no government policy, burn all the coal and oil that even exists.
Okay.
In that nightmare scenario, they predict a 1 meter level of sea rise. So
by when?
Yeah, that's the thing. By 2100. So we have a lot of time. Even in that nightmare scenario, we have a lot of time before.
Now this has changed, because I know that it was 6 feet or 2 meters by 2100. This has been
so that's
back in 16.
That is not what is in the consensus. There are outlier studies which claim that the consensus is too conservative and that this is the actual numbers. So if you go read, RCP 8.5 would be your search term.
All right. So, we'll grant that. So we're saying that in the worst case, they're saying the worst case scenario is that.
But I will just, for the sake of discussion, I'll just give 2 meters. Like I wrote an article on this a ways back. So let's just give 2 meters, right? Like that's not the consensus at all. It's double the consensus, in fact. But let's say the consensus is wrong.
Okay, so that's 6 feet.
So folks are full in the theory, but okay, let's say the consensus is wrong, and it's worse, right? And it's 2 meters instead of 1 meter.
Okay.
And that's if the world fucking goes completely mad and, technology doesn't improve in the next century.
So you would make the argument that a 2 meter rise or a 1 meter rise or 2 meter rise, it would be an insignificant problem for the, would be a problem that is relatively small as compared to the other problems that currently exist.
Well, so relative to the time scale, for me, like time is always important, and it's the thing that everyone ignores in the climate change discussion and a lot of other issues too. But the time scale is very, very important. We're not talking about a fucking tsunami that's coming in overnight and flooding all the coastal areas of the world. What we're talking about is a slow, measured increase in the general sea level, right? And if the worst case scenario even plays out, which I don't even think is likely, but like if it is 1 meter, but for the purposes of this discussion, we're going to double that to 2.
So you're going to make the argument then that as it slowly rides, then those on the very edge of the coast will make the adjustment. Then the next level will make the adjustment, and it'll be slow over decades and making the time. So it'd be something that we would be able to adapt to. And so, whereas we need to be more focused with immediate concerns that are less easy to adapt to, that we have less time?
For me, that's why, again, I go back to the term relative. Think about relative to the sea level rise in 100 years.
Okay.
You think about how much society, technology, science is going to change within that same time period that we're talking about.
I mean,
think about 1917. Think about the world of 1917. Now, let's imagine we had a time machine and we just go randomly abduct some idiot from 1917. We bring them here and say, look around you. You know, we bring them back to wherever they were from. To, let's say they were in a coastal city, and we say, what do you notice most about it? I mean, what's the biggest difference?
Do you
imagine they would say the sea level?
It depends if they lived on a coastal city and they went there and it didn't exist anymore.
Then I would say probably that's not what the first thing they would notice.
Do you? So you would say, now I don't know that I agree with this, but let me just get your opinion on it. You think that climate change is going to be something that we're going to be able to counteract with technology?
It seems obvious to me. I mean, because if you look at the rate of technological advancement compared to the rate of climate change, I mean, we're really talking apples to orange. I mean, we're talking about exponential growth versus not. You know?
So would you admit that the only way, though, that the technology is going to advance to the point where we can combat that climate change or to reverse it or make it is if we put researching dollars towards that technology?
Not necessarily, because markets have been responsible for the vast majority of technological improvements. Now, you can make arguments for specific things, right? Like the race to space, for example, or the internet, even, you know, the major discovery. But a libertarian could always come back and say, well, do you believe that if, you know, Alexander Graham Bell, and I know this is historically inaccurate, but let's say, Thomas Edison, like if he didn't invent the light bulb, does that mean it never would have been invented? I know that.
Sure. So would you say that the reason that that climate change is a problem now is because we have been focused on innovation, but innovation for a very immediate, to meet immediate goals, to meet immediate problems, or immediate needs, or immediate wants. We don't have a long-term value. So what makes you think that over the next 75 years, that if we don't view climate change as the biggest deal that we need to go and do something about it, what makes us think that we're going to change the mindset so that we're not going to sacrifice our environment in order to produce goods to meet some immediate goals?
Yeah.
So we know, and we've known for a long time, that carbon emissions cause climate change, or at least contribute to it in some way, or at least has been suspected. And yet, how many years have we even been building cars now? 100 years. Mm-hmm. So now we've been building cars with the combustion engine for 100 years, and we continue to use the same technology because it's effective, it's cheap, we've got it highly designed, it does what we want it to do. There's been no drive to, I don't want to say no, of course we have Tesla now, but over the course of 100 years, there's been almost no drive to new technology. So now we have 75 more years. So the same mindset, we would have to make a significant change in our mindset in order for me to accept that we're going to change that. We're going to move away from combustion engines. Under what policy, besides making climate change a big deal, would convince a car manufacturer to move away from the combustion engine? I mean, a proven solution as opposed to a non-proven solution.
Yeah, so markets are simply the answer, and I know this is going to take a much deeper explanation because I know I have to get into progressive ideology. I have to explain the difference between intentions and consequences, and the invisible hand of capitalism, which is a real phenomenon, believe it or not.
But it doesn't work quickly. That's the point. The invisible hand
works very quickly. I mean,
it takes time.
that businesses are interested in profit. It's always the case. So because of that, market support.
But the whole point is that the profit doesn't come from the new innovations. So
it doesn't come from the desire to do good in society. So that's what the invisible hand is. They're not trying to improve society. Their motivation is profit. But consequently, them being motivated by profit produces actual measurable benefits to society, even though that's not what they're actually trying to do.
They
are doing it inadvertently.
Would you say that the benefits to society that have been produced over the last 100 years by the invisible hand of the market have taken into account climate change, or have worked?
I would measure all, like, if we were to be very generous to people who think climate change is as like the worst thing ever, and if we added up all of the negative consequences to that against the positive consequences of markets over the last 100 years,
mm-hmm.
I mean, it wouldn't be a comparison. It would be like me comparing you to a bacteria.
So basically, concern for the environment has taken a back seat because of all the good that ignoring it does.
Well, no, see, that's the other ironic thing. So concern for the environment is directly related to wealth, right? So as it just happens to be the case that wealthier people have more concern for the environment. I don't know why. I assume it's because they're already having every other need taken care of, and so they have time to think about other shit. So like I lived in Vietnam for a year, and it is the case that poor people could not give a rat's ass about the environment.
Would you caveat that to say that individuals that are wealthy care about the environment, but companies that are wealthy do not care about the environment? So
I would say that because there are individuals within those companies, and they're kind of normal, right? Like they're not absolutely evil and absolutely good. They're within.
But they are driven by profit.
They are driven by profit, absolutely.
Right. And so are there more people who do not care about the environment, or do care about the environment, that are buying product?
If we vague in general terms, it's
we said at what point of wealth do people start caring about the environment, and then we can draw
but it's not
conclusion.
An exact thing. I mean, that too is based on individuals, right? Because I mean, it could be the case that you're dealing with, like a Native American who, just intrinsically as part of their culture, or a Hawaiian even, they just have no regard for Western concepts. So
are you Hawaiian?
Yeah.
So what would happen to Hawaii if the sea level rose 6 feet?
It's funny you ask. I actually read an article. You can check it out on my website, but I have a map too. My wife's a realtor, so like I use the Zillow maps and things like that. And I did catch a lot of heat from the real estate industry or whatever. But essentially my argument is this: like, based on the actual measure, I'm taking actual data. Like, there's a website you can go to and say, okay, 2 meters or 10 meters or whatever sea level rise you want, and they'll map it for you. And so I took these maps. I was like, okay, here's what it is now: 1 meter, 2 meter. And we looked at a comparison of these things. What we find is that essentially oceanfront homes in Hawaii, which, we're talking about millionaires more or less, they may have to move in 50 years.
Okay. Now, how long before your beaches? I went to, before my wedding, we went to Hawaii for our honeymoon. How long before your beaches are gone?
Yeah, so that's the thing about beaches. Like, just because they're moving in doesn't, I mean, that's where the new beachfront is, like wherever the ocean is.
That's how it worked before the coastal line was developed. So would we then have to knock down the houses so that the beach will be able to come in? When you have a modern age developed buildings, you won't have beaches because you'll be hitting up against modern structures that won't erode, right?
So the $1 million oceanfront homes, at some point, approximately 50 years, they'll have to move. But then I was, my response was like, okay, how many of you guys actually live in a house that's over 100 years old? Any of you? Do any of you live in a house that is actually that old? So you are probably going to rebuild at some point anyways. And you could simply move back a little bit, right? If at some point the ocean level is you're going to be underwater, right? So why not, since you're going to rebuild your home anyways, and we know that based on the data, why
Is
not
this the
just
case for all the Hawaiian Islands? I'm not familiar.
I mean, I'm talking about in general. I mean, I'm sure. I mean, there are some native Hawaiian who like still live, and they got lucky because they found some documents that prove they were always there. But in this case, we're talking about mostly foreigners who have $1 million homes on the beach, and they're just going to have to rebuild at some point, which they were going to do anyways. But it's going to be in a slightly different location.
All right, so we've focused on. So even if I were to grant you that the rising sea level is not as big of a problem as it would seem, to anyone who lives below 6 feet elevation of sea level, are there any other impacts of climate change that you don't think they're a big deal, like the change in the agriculture, change in the the seasons?
So, I have a response to that too, of course. So in terms of agriculture, this is super important. I wish more people knew about this, but it is the case that we have, from 5 years ago, we've gone from producing meat like beef, steak, hamburger in a lab. Mm-hmm. 5 years ago, that cost millions of dollars. A couple years ago, it was down to tens of thousands. Right now, as it stands, we can do it for hundreds of dollars a pound. It's not unreasonable to suggest that at some point in the future, farming will become obsolete. And I'm talking about like cattle, livestock, things like that, animal husbandry. That is probably going to become obsolete at the point at which markets decide it will, right? So at the point at which lab-grown meat becomes substantially cheaper or equal to raising livestock and killing animals, that's probably the point at which humanity is going to switch over to lab-grown meat. And then I think what's going to happen eventually is that once society is used to not killing animals and things, I think eventually it's going to be outlawed. I think they're going to say, wait a minute, why, what right do we have to kill animals? Because, you can just go buy your meat in the store. You need to buy. So I think at first it's going to be the case that, it's going to be like real meat is going to be a luxury items that the wealthy enjoy. But I think eventually it's going to be phased out completely.
And do you think this would also apply similarly to traditional crops, non-animal crops?
Yeah, with GE technology, I mean, for me, climate change is a joke. Climate change can't keep pace with science. It just cannot. It's just not.
All right. So here I'm going to then turn this around on you. You say climate change isn't that big of a deal. But in order to respond to climate change, we're going to have to relocate coastal cities, rebuild homes that are too close to the water. We're going to have to transition from animal husbandry to lab-grown meat. We're going to have to transition from traditional farming to I don't want to say lab grown, but to mega farms that grown.
Wait, hang on a second. You're not opposed to lab grown meat, are you?
No, I'm not opposed to it. I'm just saying, if you put all that stuff together, that seems like a big deal to me. So you're talking about changing the way that humanity has always grown food, the way that humanity has always eaten. So climate change is going to bring about, single-handedly.
Not climate change, markets.
In the response to climate change.
It's not a response. That's the thing. It's not like climate change is going on independently of what's really going on in human societies, and that's markets. Markets is the real deal. That's what's really going on in our society. Climate change is something going on in the background that can't actually keep pace with what humans are doing.
But it still seems to me that if we're going to have to make these transitions, you're trying to make the argument. It seems that we would make these transitions anyway if we were not feeling the pressure brought about by climate change. And I would argue, given human history, the entirety of human history, we do what works and we keep doing what works. So the only reason we change is that what works stops working. So climate change, in my opinion, is what's going to cause what used to work to stop working, which will cause the markets to correct for it. And so then,
wait, what would it stop specifically?
It would make it harder to grow regular crops. It would make it harder to keep animals. It would make us harder to keep our homes in the same place.
I'm describing. You know that I'm describing a technology that already exists, right? It's not hypothetical. This technology exists.
Well, I'm not making the argument that climate change has not already impacted the world. I mean, we are being impacted by climate change right now as we speak. It is what's driving these innovations that you're seeing in the market.
Profit is driving it, not.
But there would be no profit. Okay. It is not more profitable to make lab-grown meat than it is to grow to farm cows.
Not yet.
Not yet. But in that technology would not even exist if it hasn't become less profitable to grow cows the traditional way. The reason it is less profitable to grow cows the traditional way, in order to bring more people into looking for alternatives, I would say we can link that back directly to climate change, because we've never had a problem in breeding animals before. That's something that we've done through human history since we domesticated.
But that's like saying, we've always been riding horses. We've had horses and carriages forever. Why should we move on to cars or other forms of transportation? And I would say, well, because they're just better.
And we needed to do something different, right? We switched from horse-drawn carriage to cars because we needed to travel greater distances at a greater speed.
But
if we didn't need to do that,
all of this is a product of markets. It's not as though climate change drove people to decide
markets respond to
a scientific experiment of someone thinking,
would you agree that markets respond to pressure? They adapt to pressure.
Of course, yeah.
Yeah. So markets respond to the pressure. Now, tell me what provides greater pressure to climate change overall, or to the markets, than climate change. Climate change causes pressure, but
profit is a more determinate factor.
But profit is decreased because things become more difficult to create because of limitations that I would argue could be brought about and linked, at least in part, to climate change.
Which business is going for lower profits?
Businesses that aren't going for lower profits. That's my point. They want to stay at the same amount, same percentage or higher profit. So when they're doing the same job and it costs more because something has changed, if it costs more to raise beef because it costs more to raise the feed, if it costs more to raise the feed, it costs more to raise the beef, which means they're looking for something different, lab-grown beef. If you go down,
you're talking about two different groups of people. The people growing meat in labs are not the people raising cattle. They're actually in competition. That's how markets work. So they're not.
The opportunity for the people in the lab-grown beef to outperform the traditional farmers, traditional growers of cattle, happen because it now becomes more expensive for those traditionals. If it was still as cheap as it used to be.
That's not true, because the price of meat has substantially decreased. So I
would not say the price of meat has decreased. I mean,
well, the thing about this, worldwide, more people are consuming meat than they ever have. Before it used to be like some people ate meat once a month, then it went to like once a week. Now they're kind of eating like us. They eat meat pretty often, and that's a product of markets too.
That is a product of markets, but now we live at that level. Now we want to keep that. and it's becoming more difficult to keep that level because of climate change. And I mean, I think that's a big deal. We don't want to decrease to go back to having meat once a week. So that now we're having to, you know, there's a different.
Well, we're not living in poverty, also due to market. But hey, I wanted to thank you for the debate, man. I really enjoyed it.
Thank you. Take care. And I enjoyed it.